The night Marcus Webb humiliated his pregnant wife at the dinner table, he smiled like a man who had already won. He didn't know, he had already lost everything. Picture this. A long mahogany dining table. Crystal glasses catching candlelight. The scent of roasted lamb and expensive wine floating through a room full of laughter and clinking silverware. At the head of that table sits Marcus Webb, 46 years old, broad-shouldered, wearing a navy blazer like a man who has rehearsed confidence his whole life. To his left and right sit his business partners, his college friends, his golf buddies, men who admire him, men who laugh at his jokes even when they aren't funny. And at the far end of that table sits his wife. Diane. 39 years old. 8 months pregnant. Her belly round and full beneath a soft gray dress. Her hair pulled back neatly. Her hands resting in her lap, quiet, composed, the way a woman holds herself when she has learned, through long practice, that composure is armor. She is not the center of attention tonight. That is not an accident. Marcus made sure of that. He raises his glass and the room falls into comfortable laughter at something someone has just said, and then one of his partners, a loud man named Brett, leans forward and waves his hand toward Diane. So what does your wife do again, Marcus? I always forget. And Marcus chuckles. Not a nervous chuckle. A comfortable one. Diane? He glances down the table the way you'd glance at a piece of furniture you're not sure matches the room. She dabbles. Little consulting business. You know. Keeps her busy while she's been home. Dabbles. That word hangs in the air like smoke. Diane does not flinch. She does not look up from her glass. Her jaw tightens, barely, the way a person tightens when they have bitten their tongue so many times the inside of their mouth is scar tissue. Brett laughs. Ha. Home office life. Living the dream, right? More laughter. More clinking. And Diane sits at the end of the table, her hand resting on her stomach, feeling the baby move, a quiet, rolling nudge from the inside, as if even the child knows that something important is happening tonight. But here's the truth no one at that table knew yet. Earlier that same morning, at exactly 11:14 a.m., Diane Webb had signed a contract. $70 million. The largest licensing deal in the history of her industry. A deal she had quietly, brilliantly negotiated over the course of 14 months while Marcus told anyone who asked that she was taking some time off. The press release was scheduled to drop in 48 hours. And Marcus had no idea. Not about the deal. Not about what she had been building. Not about the quiet, devastating storm that was already in motion. He raised his glass and laughed again, his voice filling the room like it always did. He was so sure of what he knew. He had no idea what he didn't. And what happened next, no one was prepared for. Before we continue, to our new viewers joining today, tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe and say hello in the comments. I enjoy recognizing and welcoming members of our growing family. Now you might be wondering, who is Diane Webb, really? How does a woman sit at a dinner table while her husband calls her dabbling and smile through it, when she is carrying $70 million in her handbag? And more importantly, why didn't she say something? What kind of woman builds a secret empire while her husband is busy performing for an audience? Let me tell you. Diane Okafor, that was her name before the wedding, grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the second daughter of a high school chemistry teacher and a woman who ran a small but respected catering business out of their home kitchen. From the time she was 11 years old, Diane understood something that most people don't learn until it's too late. She understood that the loudest person in the room is almost never the most powerful. Her father used to say it differently. He'd say, "Still water runs deep, Diane. Still water runs deep." She remembered that every single time Marcus talked over her at dinner parties. She remembered it every time he introduced her as my wife without her name. She remembered it on the night he told her, gently, the way men do when they want to sound supportive while actually being dismissive, that maybe her consulting idea was better left as a hobby. "You're smart, baby. But the market's brutal. I just don't want to see you get hurt." She had smiled, nodded, and gone back to her home office. And kept building. But here is the question that should stop you right now. Why hadn't she told him? Why, for 14 months, had she kept the biggest deal of her career completely hidden from her husband? What had happened between them that made silence feel safer than sharing? That answer is not simple. And it matters more than you might think. Because this story isn't just about a dinner table. It isn't just about a contract. This is a story about what happens when a man spends years looking at his wife, truly looking at her, and seeing nothing but a reflection of his own assumptions. And what happens when the woman behind that reflection decides, quietly and completely, that she is done living inside someone else's story. But to understand what happened next, we have to go back. Back to the beginning. Back to when Marcus and Diane were not yet husband and wife, when they were just two people in a world full of possibility, and the worst thing between them hadn't happened yet. Because the betrayal didn't begin at that dinner table. It began much, much earlier. And when you understand where it started, the ending will hit you differently. That is a promise. Marcus Webb met Diane Okafor at a conference in Chicago. He was 31. She was 24. He was presenting a panel on real estate investment strategy. She was in the third row, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, her pen moving fast, her face completely still. He noticed her stillness first. In a room full of people nodding and smiling and performing engagement, she was just thinking. Absorbing. Processing. He asked her a question from the stage, one of those crowd-directed questions that speakers use to feel connected. She answered it in 11 words, and those 11 words were sharper than anything he'd planned to say all afternoon. He found her at the reception afterward. "You stopped the whole room," he told her. "No," she said, not looking up from her drink. "You did. I just gave you something true to work with." He fell in love with that, with her precision, her confidence, her refusal to perform smallness for anyone. He proposed 18 months later on a rooftop in Atlanta. She said yes before he finished the sentence. But here's what neither of them knew yet: love is not enough if you don't also know each other. And they were about to find out just how differently they saw the world. In the first year of marriage, things were good. Not perfect, but genuinely good, the kind of good that comes from two intelligent people choosing each other with full attention. Diane had been running a boutique business consulting practice since she was 22. Small clients, steady reputation, growing word of mouth. She had a gift that was hard to name but easy to feel. She could walk into a business, spend 48 hours listening, and identify the one thread, the one overlooked opportunity, that if pulled correctly, would change everything. Her clients called her the decoder. She'd never advertised. She didn't need to. Marcus, meanwhile, was on a rocket. His real estate portfolio was growing. He was being featured in local business magazines. He was getting invited to the kind of rooms that felt, from the outside, like a rival. And gradually, not all at once, but gradually, the way a tide moves, something shifted in how he saw her. He had always admired her quietly. But admiration, it turned out, had a ceiling. And that ceiling had a name. It was ego. It started with small things. At dinner parties, he'd describe her business with just enough vagueness to make it sound smaller than it was. "Diane does consulting. You know, small businesses, that kind of thing." She noticed. She said nothing. Then came the conference season. Marcus had been invited to speak at a national real estate summit. He asked Diane to come along, as his guest. She cleared her schedule. At the networking dinner, a woman Diane had consulted for 2 years earlier recognized her immediately. "Diane Okafor. Oh my goodness. You have no idea, the strategy you gave us completely turned our company around. We went from barely surviving to our best year in a decade." The table turned to look at Diane. And Marcus, for just a split second, looked at her differently. Not with pride. With something closer to recalibration. Like he had just realized he'd been sleeping next to someone he hadn't fully accounted for. He laughed warmly, put his arm around her shoulder. "That's my wife." But on the car ride home, he was quiet. And Diane noticed that too. The second year of marriage brought a surprise they hadn't planned for, a pregnancy. Not unwanted. But unexpected. And with it came decisions. Diane decided, on her own terms, for her own reasons, to step back from client-facing work during the third trimester. She had been building something bigger anyway, something behind the scenes that required quiet and concentration. Marcus took that decision and repackaged it in his mind. She's taking time off. She needs to focus on the baby. The consulting was always small anyway. He didn't say these things out loud. He didn't need to. They showed up in the way he answered questions about her. In the way he stopped asking about her work. In the way he'd say how are you feeling but never what are you working on. She noticed. She kept building. Because here's what Marcus didn't know, and this is the part that changes everything. 14 months before that dinner party, Diane had been approached by a private equity group out of New York. They had been watching the results she delivered for a mid-size retail brand over a 2-year engagement. The brand had been bleeding money when she arrived. When she left, they were profitable, restructured, and had tripled their operational efficiency. The equity group wanted her methodology. Not just a consultation. Not just a contract. They wanted to license her entire framework, the diagnostic system she had built and refined over 15 years of practice, and deploy it across a portfolio of 63 companies in 9 countries. The deal on the table, $70 million. Paid out over 5 years. With royalties. Diane read the offer on a Tuesday morning, alone at her kitchen desk, with Marcus already on his way to a golf game. She closed the document. She made herself a cup of tea. And she thought for a long time. She should have told him. She knew that. Part of her wanted to. But another part, the part that had watched him describe her as dabbling at 3 different dinner parties, asked a quiet, devastating question. If he doesn't believe in what I've built, does he deserve to know before it becomes real? That question doesn't have an easy answer. And if you're being honest with yourself right now, you understand exactly why she asked it. She hired an attorney. She began negotiations. She set a boundary. This information stays inside these walls until the ink is dry. For 14 months, she built. She negotiated. She revised. She finalized. And every morning, Marcus got up, kissed her cheek, and left for a world he assumed was bigger than hers. He had no idea that the world she was building was about to dwarf his own. But the night before everything changed, the night of the dinner party, Diane sat at that table and felt the baby kick and thought. 48 hours. Just 48 more hours. She just had to hold her stillness 48 more hours. She almost made it. The dinner party was Brett Calloway's idea. Brett was Marcus's oldest business partner, the kind of man who scheduled fun the way other men scheduled meetings. He'd booked the private dining room at Rosewood, a restaurant in Midtown Atlanta that charged more for bread service than most people spent on a full meal. 12 guests. Long table. Someone had ordered too much wine already. Diane had almost stayed home. She was 8 months pregnant. Her back ached. She was 48 hours from the most significant moment of her professional life, and the last thing she wanted was to sit at a table and perform cheerfulness for people who had never once asked her a question that required a real answer. But Marcus had been insistent. You haven't come to anything in months, he'd said, not unkindly. It'll be good for you. Fresh air. Real food. She'd looked at him across the bedroom and thought, you have no idea who you're talking to. But she went. She was fine for the first hour. The appetizers. The initial conversations. The ritual performance of catching up. She talked to Brett's wife, Sandra, about a book they'd both read. She listened to a man named Gerald describe his daughter's college applications with the focused interest she gave everything. She was fine. Until Brett made his comment. So what does your wife do again, Marcus? I always forget. And Marcus, her husband, the man who had watched her work until midnight for 15 years, said the word. Dabbles. Something moved in Diane's chest. Not rage. Not yet. It was something more like grief. The specific grief of being reduced by someone who should have known your size. She felt the baby kick again. She looked down at her hands. She thought of the signed contract in her home office drawer. $70 million. Her name on the front page. The attorney had hugged her when they finished. You've just changed the landscape of your entire field, he had said. Dabbles. She picked up her water glass and took a slow sip. But then Brett wasn't done. He leaned across the table, wine glass in hand, and said something he clearly thought was charming. No offense, Diane, but honestly, isn't it kind of a relief? Having Marcus carry the weight while you focus on the baby? I mean, that's what we all want for our wives, right? He looked around the table for confirmation. Several people nodded. Some women just aren't built for the pressure. And that's completely fine. The table laughed. Marcus laughed. And Diane felt something change in her, not break. Crystallize. She looked at her husband's face. He was still laughing. He had not corrected Brett. He had not said a single word in her defense. He looked comfortable. And in that comfort, in that easy, unthinking comfort, Diane understood something she had been circling for 2 years. He did not see her. Not really. He never had. If you're feeling this right now, comment "I see her" below. Because sometimes that's all it takes. Someone just has to see you. What happened next, Diane did not plan. She set her water glass down, very carefully, and she looked at Brett with the kind of calm that can only come from someone who has been sitting on something enormous. "Brett," she said. "Can I ask you something?" The table quieted. Something in her voice, that stillness her father had described, made people pay attention. "Of course," Brett said, still smiling. "What would you say the value of a licensing deal looks like, in a field like brand strategy?" "Ballpark." Brett blinked. "I mean, it depends. Could be anything. A few $100,000, maybe, for a solid regional framework." "Why?" "Because mine closed this morning," Diane said. $70 million. Signed at 11:14 a.m. The table went completely silent. Not the polite silence of a pause in conversation. The absolute silence of a room full of people recalibrating everything they thought they understood. Brett stared at her. Sandra's mouth opened slightly. Marcus, her husband, the man who had just laughed at the word dabbles, turned to look at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not pride. It was not joy. It was something that looked almost like fear. $70 million, Diane repeated, clearly, the way a teacher repeats something on a board. Licensing framework. Private equity group. 9 countries. She picked up her fork. But yes. It's a relief to be home. She took a bite of her salad. And the table stayed silent for what felt like a full minute. That's when everything changed. The drive home was the longest 40 minutes of their marriage. Marcus sat behind the wheel with his hands at 10 and 2, his jaw tight, his eyes on the road. Diane sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap. The baby was still. The radio was off. Finally, at a red light 7 minutes from home, Marcus said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Diane turned to look at him. "I'm telling you now. That's not what I mean." "I know." Another silence. $70 million, Diane. "Yes. And you didn't say anything." "Not once. For 14 months. She looked out her window. "No." He exhaled, a long, controlled breath. "Why?" She turned back to him. And she said, very quietly, the thing she had been turning over in her mind for longer than she could name. "Because I needed to know if you believed in me before it was worth believing in." The light turned green. He didn't move. The car behind them honked once. He drove. What would you have done? Sit with that question. Because it doesn't have a clean answer. When they got home, Marcus went straight to his office. Diane went to the kitchen, made herself a cup of chamomile tea, and sat at her desk, the same desk where she had read the original offer, alone, 14 months ago. She opened the signed contract and read her name on the front page again. Diane E. Okafor Webb. Founder. Architect. Author. She put both hands on her belly. "We did it," she said softly. The baby kicked twice. But Marcus was not sitting quietly in his office. He was on his phone. He called Brett. He called Gerald. He called 2 other men from the dinner table. And what he said to them, in a low voice behind a closed door, was not what you would hope a husband would say. He said, "Did you know about this? Did anyone know? Not, 'I'm so proud of her.' Not, 'should have seen this coming.' Not even, 'I owe her an apology.' Just, 'Did anyone know? Did I miss something everyone else could see?'" And that night, sleeping beside his wife in the dark, Marcus Webb discovered that the worst feeling in the world is not being betrayed by someone you love. It's realizing you betrayed them first, and spent years too busy being impressive to notice. But it didn't end there. Not even close. Because the next morning brought something that would crack this story open in a way no one, not Diane, not Marcus, not the people at that dinner table, could have predicted. Diane woke at 5:45, She always had, even pregnant, with her mind already running through a list of things she needed to handle before the press release dropped. She made coffee. She reviewed her talking points for the media call scheduled that afternoon. She sent her attorney a brief message confirming the release timeline. Marcus came downstairs at 7. He was dressed. He had showered. He looked like himself, the polished, broad-shouldered Marcus who the world saw. But something in his eyes was different. He sat across from her at the kitchen island and said, "I'm sorry about last night." Diane looked up from her notes. "Which part?" He didn't answer right away. He poured coffee. He wrapped both hands around the mug. "All of it," he said finally. It was not a small thing for Marcus to say. He was a man who had built his identity on always knowing, always being right, always being ahead. Saying "I'm sorry" required dismantling a wall he'd spent years building. Diane nodded. She didn't speak. "I've been making you smaller," he said. "For a long time. I didn't realize I was doing it. But that's not an excuse." She studied his face. She knew this moment mattered. Not just for them, for the child between them. For what they were going to be to each other in the years ahead. She said, "I need to know something, Marcus. And I need you to answer honestly." He nodded. "If I had told you 14 months ago, when the offer first came in, what would you have done?" He opened his mouth. Closed it. Tried again. "I want to say I would have supported you completely." He looked down at his coffee. "But I'm not sure I would have. I think I would have found a way to steer it. Question it. Make it smaller without meaning to." The honesty of that answer landed in the kitchen like something heavy. Diane held it for a moment. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For telling me the truth. But honesty, as it turns out, is a beginning, not a resolution." And the world outside their kitchen was about to get very loud. At 9 a.m. sharp, the release went out. By 9:15, Diane's phone was ringing in a way it had never rung before. Industry publications. Business journals. 2 major newspapers. A morning show segment producer who had seen the headline and wanted her on air within the week. The headline read, "Columbus-born strategist Diane Okafor Webb signs historic $70 million licensing deal, the decoder goes global." Her inbox filled with messages from clients she hadn't heard from in years. From mentors who had watched her grow. From women she had never met who wrote things like, "I needed to see this today. Thank you for existing." Sandra, Brett's wife, texted a single line, "Diane. I had no idea. I'm sorry for last night. You were magnificent." Brett himself did not text. That told Diane everything she needed to know about Brett. Marcus sat in his home office and watched his wife's name trend on LinkedIn. He watched the articles stack up. He read them, each one, not skimming, but reading, the way you read something when you're learning about a person you realize you underestimated. One profile piece had been written 6 months ago, pre-release, and was now being published with new context. It described Diane's methodology in detail. It quoted the CEO of the private equity firm, "We've seen frameworks built by teams with 40 years of combined experience. Diane built something that outperforms all of them. Alone. In a home office. While raising a business, a marriage, and now a child." Marcus read that last sentence twice. He stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and sent her a text. "I just read the profile piece. You are extraordinary. I'm sorry it took me this long to say that the way you deserve to hear it." Diane was in the middle of a media call when the text came in. She saw it. She kept talking to the journalist. She finished her sentence, wrapped up the call, and then put the phone down on her desk. She cried for about 90 seconds. Not sad tears. The kind that come from years of pressure finally releasing. Then she wiped her face, picked up the phone, and called the next journalist. But here's what no one knew was about to happen next. It started with Brett. 2 days after the press release, Brett Calloway called Marcus. Not to congratulate Diane. Not to apologize. To make sure Marcus understood something. "Look," Brett said, his voice carrying the particular brightness of a man trying to reframe his behavior before anyone else could. "Last night was just, you know how those dinners are. No one meant anything by it. Right? We didn't know." "Right," Marcus said. So she's not going to make this a thing. Marcus was quiet for a moment. A thing, he repeated. You know what I mean. And here is where Marcus Webb, for the first time in perhaps years, did something that surprised even himself. No, he said. I don't know what you mean. My wife signed a $70 million deal. She was sitting at your dinner table when you told her she wasn't built for pressure. You told her it was a relief that she was staying home. And you're calling me to find out if she's going to make it a thing. Brett went quiet. I think, Marcus said slowly, that the question you should be asking is whether I'm going to make it a thing. Because I sat at that table and I let it happen. And that's something I have to figure out how to live with. He hung up. That's when everything shifted. 3 weeks later, their daughter was born. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. A full head of dark hair. Eyes that looked, in the first hour, like they were already studying the room. Marcus held her in the delivery room and experienced the particular undoing that comes over a person when they hold a child for the first time, when all the architecture of their self-importance suddenly seems very small compared to this new, impossibly real thing. He looked at Diane, lying in the bed, exhausted, luminous. What are we going to name her? He asked. They had disagreed about names for months. It had been a running tension in their household, Marcus preferring names that felt classic, strong, inherited. Diane leaning towards something different. She looked at him. I'd like to name her after my grandmother. Adise. He held the baby. He looked at her eyes, still learning to focus. Adise, he said, testing the shape of it. He looked back at Diane. Yes, he said. That's who she is. But the real reckoning, the one neither of them had fully faced, was still waiting. Because a $70 million deal and a new baby and one honest morning conversation do not fix years of being made small. And Diane had a decision to make. 6 weeks after Adise was born, Diane went back to work. Not physically. She was still home, still nursing, still operating from the desk in the back room. But she was back. And for the first time in their marriage, Marcus did something she hadn't anticipated. He made space. He started asking about her calls. Not casually, not as conversation filler, but sitting down, putting his phone away, and asking real questions. What did the equity group say? How is the deployment going in the European markets? What's the challenge you're trying to solve right now? He started introducing her differently. At a family gathering 2 months later, his cousin asked who she was. And Marcus said, without hesitation, this is Diane. She just closed the largest licensing deal in her field. And she's the mother of my daughter. And she is the most remarkable person I know. Diane heard it from across the room. She stood there for a moment. She didn't cry this time. She just exhaled. But here is what she had not yet told him. And when she did, everything would be reframed. Everything. 3 months after Adise was born, Diane sat Marcus down at the kitchen island, the same place where their most honest conversations had always happened, and she said. There's something I haven't told you. Marcus looked up from his coffee. She slid a folder across the granite toward him. What is this? Read it. He opened the folder. Inside were documents from Diane's attorney. And at first, what he read confirmed the fear that had been sitting quietly in the back of his mind since the night of the dinner party. They were preliminary divorce consultation notes. Dated 14 months ago. The same week she had received the original offer. Marcus went very still. You were going to leave me, he said. I was considering it, she said. Yes. He sat with that. He didn't deflect. He didn't argue. I can't pretend I don't understand why, he said finally. Diane nodded. I know. What changed? She looked at him for a long moment. And then she told him the second thing. The thing in the folder he hadn't gotten to yet. Keep reading, she said. He turned the page. What he found there was not a divorce filing. It was a letter. Handwritten, dated 11 months ago, addressed to no one in particular, the kind of letter a person writes to clarify their own mind rather than to send. It was in Diane's handwriting. And it began. I have been asking myself why I'm staying. I've made lists. I've consulted an attorney. I've thought about what my life looks like with and without him. And every single time I come to the same conclusion, not from fear, not from comfort, but from something harder to name. I stay because I have seen who Marcus is at his best. And I believe, despite all evidence from the last 2 years, that the man at his best is still in there. That the man who found me in a crowd because I was thinking is still capable of choosing me the same way. So I am making a decision. Not to stay in what this marriage has become, but to stay for what it could still be. And I am going to build this deal in silence, not to punish him, but to give him one last chance to prove that his love is not conditional on my smallness. If he continues to make me smaller after the world can see my size, then I will have my answer. And if he doesn't, if he rises to it, then so will we. Marcus read the letter twice. By the second time, his hands weren't entirely steady. He looked up at her. You gave me a test, he said. Not accusatory. Almost wondering. I gave us both a test, she said quietly. I didn't know which way it would go. And? She held his gaze. And you're sitting here. At this table. Holding that letter. With your daughter asleep in the next room. And you haven't deflected or made this about you or called Brett to ask if it's going to become a thing. A pause. So I think we have our answer, she said. That moment, that quiet, unremarkable Tuesday morning in a kitchen in Atlanta, was the most important moment of their marriage. Not the contract. Not the dinner table. Not the birth of their daughter. This. 2 people choosing each other with full information for the first time. They did not live happily ever after. Not in the way fairy tales promise. What they lived was harder and better than that. Diane's deal became one of the most discussed business stories of that year in her industry. The profile piece ran in a national magazine. She was invited to speak at conferences she had once attended quietly, taking notes. She sat on panels. She mentored other women, particularly women who were being told, by people who should have known better, that their ambitions were a hobby. She always began those conversations the same way. Still water runs deep, she would say. My father taught me that. Build in the quiet. Let the results speak. Marcus rebuilt. Not his career, that had never needed rebuilding. He rebuilt his attention. He learned to ask questions before offering opinions. He learned that supporting someone does not mean steering them. He went to a therapist, alone, without Diane asking him to, and spent several months untangling the architecture of ego that had been handed to him since childhood. The scripts about what a husband was supposed to look like. What a wife was supposed to represent. Who was supposed to carry which ambitions publicly. It was not comfortable work. He did it anyway. But there were costs. Their marriage survived. But some things didn't come back. The ease of early years, that particular uncomplicated closeness, had been changed by the dinner table, by the word dabbles, by 14 months of necessary silence. They had new intimacy now, earned and conscious and real. But they would never have the old kind again. Some things, once broken, don't return to their original shape. They become something different. Sometimes the different thing is stronger. Sometimes it is just different. Marcus understood that. He didn't try to pretend it was the same. Brett Calloway never apologized to Diane. She had not expected him to. What she had not expected was how little it mattered. The women at that table, Sandra, and 2 others, had reached out quietly in the weeks that followed. Not grand gestures. Just honest words. I should have said something. I didn't. I'm sorry. Diane accepted those apologies the way she accepted most things, with grace and without excessive ceremony. She moved on. Adie's grew. In the first year, she was mostly sleeping and eating and looking at the world with that concentrated gaze that her mother recognized immediately. Already thinking, Diane thought every time she watched her daughter study the ceiling fan with deep, focused attention. She's already thinking. Marcus saw it too. He sat with Adie's one morning while Diane was on a call, and the baby looked at him, really looked at him, and he felt something he couldn't quite name. Not just love. Something closer to accountability. The feeling of being seen by someone who has no use for performance. He looked back at her. I'm going to do better, he said. She made a sound that might have been agreement. He laughed. For the first time in months, he laughed with no performance in it at all. And that's when Diane realized, the truth hadn't just changed their lives. It had revealed who they had always been, and given them the choice to become who they still could be. Before I let you go, I have to ask you something. And I want you to sit with this honestly, because this story deserves a real answer. What would you have done? If you were Diane, sitting at that table, 8 months pregnant, $70 million quietly signed in the drawer at home, and your husband used the word dabbles to describe everything you had built. Would you have spoken? Would you have stayed quiet? Would you have waited like she did? Or would the weight of it have broken through before the 48 hours were up? There's no wrong answer. But there is a revealing one. And here is the harder question, the one that will bring up feelings if you let it. Was Marcus redeemable? Some of you are saying yes. He apologized. He changed. He did the work. Some of you are saying, it's not about whether he changed. It's about whether she should have had to wait that long to be seen. Both of those answers are right. And both of them are also incomplete. That's the uncomfortable truth about real relationships. The ones worth keeping are almost never simple, and the ones that hurt the most are sometimes also the ones that teach us the most about ourselves. Which moment hit you the hardest? Was it the dinner table? Was it Marcus on the phone with Brett, asking if Diane was going to make it a thing? Was it the letter? The one she wrote to herself, alone, trying to figure out whether to stay? Or was it the baby, Adiz, looking at her father in the early morning light, while he made a promise to a 7-pound person who had no idea what it cost him to say it? Tell me in the comments. I read them. And I answer more than you think. A note for everyone watching who has felt what Diane felt. The stillness of building something real while the people around you decide your worth based on what they can see. The loneliness of being underestimated by someone who is supposed to know you better than anyone. The question of whether to speak or whether to let the results speak for you. You are not invisible. Still water runs deep. Keep building. If you thought this story was something, wait until you hear the next one. It's about a man who fired his best employee on a Friday afternoon, confident she needed him more than he needed her. He found out on Monday morning just how wrong he was. And what she had already done while he was still celebrating. That story is coming. And you are going to want to be here for it. Subscribe now. Click the bell. Stay in this family. Because here, we tell the stories of people who built in the quiet, and let the results do the talking. Subscribe for stories that stay with you long after they end. And to Jocelyn from the United States, Wanda from Georgia, and Juliet from Jamaica, thank you for being part of this family. You are seen, and you are welcome here. Always.